The sheriff took 3 Apache Orphans from a wagon, and a giant cowboy fought to return them. Rowan Hale had just crested the ridge when he saw the wagon sitting crooked in the pale morning light. Wheels half sunk in frost, smoke still curling from the canvas, as if the night hadn't fully let go of its terror. And before he even reached the clearing, he heard the sharp bark of Sheriff Malik ordering his men to take the little savages before someone else claims them. A command that turned Rowan's stomach colder than the November air. He pushed his massive bay horse forward, boots hitting the ground hard as he strode toward the scene. And the moment his shadow fell over the burned wagon, he saw them. 3 small Apache siblings huddled together. A girl of maybe 10, clutching a baby wrapped in a soot-dark blanket, while her brother, no older than 7, planted himself in front of them with a stick like it was a rifle, eyes blazing with terror and defiance all at once. Malik didn't even look at the children as people. Just grabbed the boy by the arm and yanked him so hard he stumbled, the girl gasping and begging in broken English for him to stop. And Rowan felt something ancient and immovable shift inside his chest, a quiet fury he hadn't felt since the day his own kin were taken from him during the war. "Sheriff," Rowan said, voice low but carrying like thunder rolling across a field. "Those children aren't cattle for you to haul off." But Malik sneered up at him, small man, big hat, bigger ego, and said, "Then ride on, Hale, because the law says they're abandoned property, and the army pays good money for kids they can turn into interpreters." Words that made Rowan's fists clench until his gloves creaked. The girl tried to reach for her brother, but one deputy pushed her back, and that was when Rowan stepped between them all, planting himself like a boulder in the sheriff's path. And the entire clearing fell silent because even Malik's men knew better than to provoke a man built like living iron with a reputation for fighting storms with his bare hands. Rowan knelt, lifting the smallest child gently from the ground, and the baby's fingers curled around his beard as if she had already decided he was safe. And Rowan whispered to her siblings, "No one's taking you." A promise spoken before he even understood what war those 4 words would start. Malik rested his hand on his revolver, lips curling into a warning that felt more like a threat. And Rowan slowly rose to his full towering height, eyes locked on the sheriff as he said, "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." A sentence that snapped the day in half and set the frontier on fire. Rowan didn't move as Malik's hand hovered near his revolver, because the children clung to his legs now, their small fingers digging into his coat like they'd grabbed hold of the last safe thing on earth. And before the sheriff could spit another order, Rowan tipped his chin toward the burned wagon and said, "Before you talk about who owns what, Sheriff, maybe look at what happened here." Then walked past him, forcing Malik to step aside as Rowan knelt by the charred wood and sifted through the wreckage with hands steady and slow. He found a woven band of beads half buried in the ash, still bright with red and turquoise patterns Apache women used to mark family lineage. And when he held it up, the girl gasped softly, touching her chest as if the missing piece of herself had been returned. And Rowan understood then that this wasn't just a burned wagon. It was a family erased, a home turned to smoke, and these 3 were all that was left. He swallowed hard when he spotted the signs no one else cared enough to read. Tracks of at least 3 raiders, not Apache, but white horse thieves. He knew their style, had chased their kind away from remote ranches before. And the realization hit him that Malik either didn't care who did this or didn't want to know, because blaming the tribe kept the town fearful and kept his badge powerful. Rowan brushed ash off his palms and turned to the girl, asking gently, "What's your name, little one?" And she hesitated before whispering, "Nayeli," then pointed to her brothers. Tahoe, and baby Issa. And the way she said their names carried so much love and so much loss, it hollowed something inside him. Rowan nodded once, slow, like he was accepting a duty he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse, and Malik scoffed from behind him, saying, "You can name 'em all you want, Hale. They're still coming with me." But Rowan stepped forward, towering over the lawman, voice calm as a winter river as he replied, "Their people will be looking for them, Sheriff. You take these children and you'll be the spark that lights a war you can't win." Yet Malik only smirked, tapping the star on his chest like it gave him godhood, snarling, "This town fears me more than any tribe." And Rowan realized with a cold certainty that Malik wasn't after justice. He was after control. The girl tugged Rowan's sleeve then, wide dark eyes pleading as she whispered, "Please, don't let him take us." And that one trembling sentence felt like a rope thrown across Rowan's heart, pulling tight until it became a vow. He positioned himself between the orphans and the sheriff fully now, feet planted, shoulders squared, and said quietly, but with iron beneath every word, "Then I guess I'm not done standing." Malik didn't expect Rowan to stand his ground. Not like this. Not with 3 half-frozen Apache children pressed behind him as if the giant cowboy had already claimed them as his own. And for one suspended moment, the whole world seemed to narrow to 2 men staring each other down in the pale morning light. The sheriff's jaw twitched as he glanced at the ranchers gathered behind him, hoping for backup. But most of them shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet Rowan's eyes because everyone in 3 Rivers knew the truth. If Rowan Hale decided to protect someone, nothing on God's earth, badge or title or threat, was going to move him. Rowan lifted Nayeli into his arms effortlessly, her small hands curling into his collar, and then he nudged Tahoe forward with one huge hand, while Issa clung to his pant leg like a shadow. And he simply walked toward his horse, turning his back on the lawman as if Malik had become irrelevant, which was the deepest insult anyone could deliver. "You walk away with those savages," Malik barked, face flushing, "and you make yourself a criminal." But Rowan didn't break stride, only answering, "Then I'll be the kind that sleeps at night," which made a few men murmur in the sheriff's direction, their discomfort rising like heat. Malik's fury cracked then. He lunged forward, grabbing Rowan's shoulder, but the mountain of a man stopped cold, looked down slowly at the hand gripping him, and said in a voice that carried to the edge of the burned clearing, "Let go before the ground forgets you ever stood on it." And Malik's fingers loosened on their own, trembling from something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Rowan swung up into the saddle with Nayeli settled against his chest, Tahoe perched behind him, and Issa tucked in front. And when Malik shouted, "One step out of this valley and you're marked for arrest," Rowan turned his horse fully then, meeting the sheriff's glare with a calm that felt sharper than any blade, replying, "You want to arrest me, Sheriff? Then you better ride hard, because I'm taking them home." With that, he guided his horse toward the canyon trail, the morning sun slipping across the snowy ridges and lighting the path ahead, as if blessing every stubborn, defiant step he took. Nayeli, small voice shaking, asked, Where are we going?" And Rowan's answer was soft but certain, "To people who will fight for you." Though inside he wondered how quickly the tribe would come. How angry they'd be to find their children stolen, and how much blood this single ride might spill. Behind them, Malik mounted hastily, shouting for his men, but none followed, leaving the sheriff red-faced and furious in the clearing. Rowan didn't look back, only tightened his grip on the reins and braced himself for whatever storm waited over the ridge, knowing one truth clearer than the cold air in his lungs. He wasn't giving these children up. Not today. Not ever. The canyon wind cut sharp as Rowan urged his horse deeper into the narrow pass, the walls rising like rust-red giants on either side, funneling every sound forward so even Nayeli's soft breaths against his chest seemed loud enough to echo. And though he kept his face steady for the children, his mind was running faster than the hooves beneath him, because every mile they rode meant one thing. The tribe would know. The tribe would come, and they would not come gently. Isa peeked over the horn of the saddle, her small voice trembling as she asked, "Will the sheriff hurt us again?" And Rowan shook his head once, firm, answering, "Not while you're under my shadow." And the way she gripped his coat told him she understood, that even if she barely knew him, she trusted him more than the men who had dragged her from her dead mother's wagon. Tahoe, quiet until now, finally whispered, "He said we were property." And Rowan felt something break inside him, a cold anger settling deep as he said, "Men like him don't get to decide who you are." The words simple but carrying the weight of a promise. He didn't speak aloud, that he would stand between them and any man who tried again. As they reached the ridge, Rowan stopped his horse, scanning the valley below. Snow still clung to the pines, smoke rising in the distance from a cluster of lodges half hidden near the river bend. And his stomach tightened because the tribe was closer than he'd hoped, close enough that scouts had likely already spotted him. "Listen," he murmured, lifting Nayeli higher so she could see over the crest. "I'm taking you back to your people, but you must stay behind me no matter who rides up." And the girl nodded slowly, though fear flickered in her dark eyes when the distant thrum of hooves reached them, faint but growing, like a heartbeat rolling across the land. Rowan pushed forward, knowing there was no turning back. Malik would be rallying a posse by now, and the canyon behind him was a choke point he couldn't risk getting trapped in. But as he descended toward the valley, 3 mounted figures emerged from the trees, moving with purpose, their silhouettes unmistakable even from afar. Apache scouts, spears lowered, horses tense and ready. Isa whimpered and hid her face, and Tahoe pressed his hand to the side of Rowan's coat as if anchoring himself to the only safety he had left. Rowan raised one hand slowly, palm open, calling out in the tribal tongue he hadn't spoken in years, "I bring your children home." And the riders halted sharply, their horses pawing the ground as they stared at the giant cowboy holding the orphans protectively against him. One scout dismounted, eyes sharp as flint, demanding, "Why do they cling to you?" And Rowan answered simply, "Because no one else did." And for a moment, just one breath, the scout's expression shifted, something like respect breaking through suspicion. But as more riders appeared beyond the trees, the weight of what was coming settled like stone in Rowan's chest. A reckoning, swift and inevitable. Rowan didn't flinch as more warriors emerged from the trees, a dozen at first, then 2 dozen, then what felt like the whole valley rising to meet him, their horses fanning out in a tightening semicircle until the canyon trail behind him was cut off entirely. But he kept his hand steady in the air and his voice even, refusing to show the fear clawing at his ribs. Nayeli held to him tighter. Isa buried her face in his coat, and Tahoe sat rigid behind him as the scout who'd dismounted stepped closer, studying the children as if searching for lies beneath their shivering bodies. "They were taken," Rowan said before the scout could speak again. "Dragged from their mother's wagon. She didn't survive." And though his words were sparse, the grief in them was enough to paint the rest. Enough to make the nearest warriors exchange glances filled with both rage and sorrow. A tall rider pushed forward then, older, broader, painted with white streaks of winter across his braids, clearly a leader. His presence quieted the circle instantly as he dismounted in a slow, deliberate movement, eyes locking on Rowan with the weight of a man who'd buried too many children. "You carried them through the snow?" he asked, voice low but edged with steel. And Rowan nodded, replying, "And fought off the sheriff who meant to claim them," which made a ripple of anger sweep through the warriors like wind against tall grass. The leader stepped close enough that Rowan could see the faint scar on his cheek, the kind carved not by battle, but by grief. And when he reached out a hand, Nayeli hesitated, glancing up at Rowan as if waiting for permission. Rowan nodded gently, whispering, "He's your kin." And Nayeli slowly leaned toward the man, who caught her with shaking hands before drawing Isa and Tahoe into his arms as well. The chief, Rowan knew now he had to be a chief, turned to the circle and said something in Apache, a sharp command that made several warriors lower their spears, but not all. One younger warrior, face painted midnight black, pointed at Rowan and spat. "Why return them? Why not keep them? Trade them? Sell them like the white men do?" And Rowan felt heat rise in his chest as every eye turned back to him. He answered with a kind of plain truth that didn't need polishing. "Because they're not mine to keep. Because someone had to carry them until their people could." Silence fell heavy. And then the chief lifted his chin slightly, saying, "This man stands alone against his own law for our children." And a murmur of respect spread through the crowd. But before the moment could settle, a distant gunshot cracked through the valley, sharp, unmistakable, and every warrior snapped to alert, horses tensing beneath them. Rowan's jaw clenched as he whispered, "Malik," because he knew the sheriff wasn't done, and the warriors knew it too. The chief handed the children to waiting women, then placed a firm hand on Rowan's shoulder and said, "Walk with us. If war is coming, we face it together." And for the first time, Rowan wasn't sure whether he'd just been saved or pulled into a storm bigger than he'd ever meant to start. Rowan followed the chief through the tightening ring of warriors, every step echoing the truth he didn't want to face. Malik hadn't just fired a warning shot, he was announcing himself, staking his claim, letting the entire valley know he was coming for blood. And the knowledge sat like cold iron in Rowan's stomach as the warriors led him toward the tree line where the sound had cracked through the air. Nayeli, Isa, and Tahoe had been taken deeper into the camp by the women, their small faces vanishing behind hide-covered walls, and Rowan felt the absence immediately, the ache of responsibility lingering on his shoulders even as the chief strode ahead with grim purpose. "Sheriff follows no law but his own hunger," the chief muttered without looking back, and Rowan answered, "He wants power more than justice," which earned him a sharp glance, the kind shared between two men who understood that enemies like Malik didn't stop unless someone stopped them. The trees thinned near the ridge, revealing a long sweep of snow and shale. And there, like a stain against the clean winter light, Malik's posse appeared. 6 riders fanned in a line, rifles drawn, Malik himself front and center, his hat pinned low and his grin twisted into something triumphant. Because he had expected this confrontation, maybe even counted on it. "Step aside, Hale," he shouted, voice slicing through the cold air. "Those kids belong to the United States Army now, and anyone helping them is an accomplice to treason." A declaration so hollow it rattled against the canyon walls, because even the men behind him shifted uneasily, as if hearing their own sheriff say the quiet part too loud. Rowan stepped forward, hands open, voice steady as he replied, "You don't want those children, Malik. You want a war you can win, a story where you're the hero who tamed the frontier." And Malik's grin widened, eyes narrowing with a feverish glint, because Rowan had named the truth he never admitted. The chief moved beside Rowan then, silent but immense, a presence that made Malik's horse sidestep nervously. And in a cold, clipped tone, he said, "These children are ours. Blood of our blood. You will not touch them again." But Malik only laughed, tilting his rifle so the barrel glinted in the weak sun as he replied, "You think I fear feathers and paint?" That insult hit the warriors like a spark thrown into dry grass. Several surged forward instantly. But Rowan raised an arm, stopping them with the sheer force of his posture, because he knew Malik wanted hot heads, wanted someone to shoot first so he could justify the massacre he'd been pushing toward for months. Rowan stepped farther out, placing himself between the two forces, heart pounding as he called, "Malik, listen. There's still a way to walk away from this without burying men on both sides." But the sheriff's answer was a slow, deliberate cocking of his rifle, the sound loud enough to fracture the frozen silence. And as that single click echoed across the ridge, Rowan understood with chilling clarity that this wasn't just a standoff anymore. This was the moment everything that mattered would either break or be saved by the thinnest thread of courage. Rowan could feel every heartbeat in his chest as Malik leveled the rifle, the barrel fixed squarely on him. But before he could speak, the chief stepped forward, hand lifting slightly in a gesture that held centuries of command behind it, and the warriors fanned out, forming a wall of bodies and resolve, their spears angled in unison, their breath rising in pale ribbons against the cold air. Malik laughed at the sight, a sharp, ugly sound as he spat. "You really think I won't fire on all of you?" But the tremor in his voice betrayed him, for even he understood the weight of facing 40 armed Apache warriors on their own land. Rowan, feeling the tide tipping toward bloodshed, raised both hands high and shouted, "Everyone hold!" And somehow, impossibly, the line froze. Warriors, horses, even the wind seemed to still as all eyes turned to him. "This doesn't end with a bullet," Rowan said, voice low but carrying, "It ends with a choice." And he saw something flicker in the chief's eyes, a recognition that the mountain man was stepping into something dangerous and sacred, a space between two worlds where one wrong word could burn everything down. Rowan stepped closer to Malik's line until the riders flinched, their rifles shifting just enough to betray fear. And he stopped only when he could see the madness pulsing in Malik's pupils. "You're outnumbered," Rowan said, "and out of reason." But Malik snarled back, "Reason? Reason died the day you turned against your own." And Rowan replied, "I didn't turn against my own. I stood for what's right. Something you stopped doing years ago." Words so sharp they sliced through the very air between them. Malik's hand tightened on the trigger, knuckles whitening. But Rowan didn't back up. Instead, he lifted his voice, speaking not to Malik, but to the posse behind him, men who shifted in their saddles with haunted eyes, men who suddenly weren't so sure they'd followed the right leader. "Look around you," Rowan called. "Is this the justice you signed up for? Pointing guns at children's protectors? Starting a war because one man can't stand being defied?" And the riders exchanged uneasy glances, one lowering his rifle a fraction, then another, and Malik sensed his hold slipping. "Raise those guns," he barked. But no one moved, and that hesitation cracked something deep inside him, a rage so wild he pushed his horse forward, jamming the rifle into Rowan's chest. Warriors surged with a roar, but Rowan shouted, "Stop!" Again, and miraculously, they held, their fury trembling beneath the surface. "Malik," Rowan said softly, "if you fire that rifle, this valley will drown in blood you can't wash off." But Malik's breath came ragged, his eyes gone glassy, and Rowan realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the sheriff wasn't hearing reason anymore. He was hearing only pride, only humiliation, only the fear that the world was changing without him. And in that fragile, breaking moment, Rowan understood that someone would have to sacrifice something, mercy, pride, or even a life, to keep the valley from collapsing into war. Malik's horse shifted beneath him, hooves scraping hard against frozen earth as the sheriff pressed the rifle deeper into Rowan's chest, the metal biting through the fabric of Rowan's coat, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath, suspended between violence and salvation. The warriors waited like coiled thunder, bows half-drawn, spears angled, their fury quiet but immense. And the chief stood a single pace behind Rowan, his expression carved from stone, trusting the mountain man to decide whether war erupted or died in the next instant. Rowan's voice came low, steady, almost gentle as he whispered, "You don't want to do this." But Malik's eyes gleamed with a fevered shine, and he hissed, "I want the world to remember who kept order when cowards like you forgot how." His finger tightening on the trigger. A single sob cracked through the air then, high, thin, terrified, and Rowan's head snapped sideways just in time to see Nayeli stumbling toward them from behind the trees, slipping past the women who reached desperately for her, her small hands trembling as she cried, "Don't hurt him." The sound hit the valley like a prayer thrown into a fire, and Malik jerked, startled by the child's sudden appearance, his aim shifting an inch, just enough for Rowan to move. He seized the rifle barrel with both hands, wrenching it upward as Malik fired, the bullet tearing through the sky with a shriek instead of flesh, scattering a flock of birds that burst from the pines in an explosion of wings. Warriors roared, surging forward. But the chief shouted a single command that froze them mid-charge, holding them back on a knife edge of obedience. Malik, thrown off balance by Rowan's force, tumbled from his saddle and hit the ground hard, scrambling backward through the snow as Rowan tossed the rifle aside, breath ragged, chest heaving from the brush with death. Nayeli ran to him, tears streaking her cheeks, clutching his coat like a lifeline as she whispered, "You said you'd come back." And Rowan dropped to one knee, pulling her close, replying, "I always will," unaware of how deeply those words would echo in the valley. Malik, wild-eyed and desperate, lunged for a fallen revolver, but 3 arrows hit the ground around his hand in a perfect triangle, each quivering with lethal warning, and he froze, staring at the chief, whose bow remained half-drawn. "Enough," the chief said, voice deep as thunderclouds building on the horizon. "This man has chosen mercy. We honor that. You will not shame this valley with your bitterness again." Rowan rose slowly, still shielding Nayeli as Malik's posse hung back, none willing to take another step in their sheriff's name, their faces pale with the realization that they had almost become murderers. Malik collapsed onto his knees, fury draining into something hollow and frightened, as he understood he stood alone, utterly alone, for the first time. Rowan didn't speak to him. There was nothing left to say, so he simply turned, lifting Nayeli into his arms as the chief placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture heavy with respect, gratitude, and a newfound bond forged not by blood, but by the choice that had just saved them all from ruin. They brought Malik back to the edge of the camp under guard, not as a prisoner of war, but as a man stripped of authority. And Rowan felt the weight of the valley's changing breath as the warriors formed a wide circle, their faces lit by the pale afternoon sun. The children sheltered behind the women, and the chief stepping forward like a man who carried both justice and sorrow in the same heartbeat. "Your law ends here," the chief said to Malik, who knelt in the snow with shaking hands, his hat lost, his pride leaking out of him like warmth into winter air. And though Rowan felt no pity, he felt no triumph either. Just a quiet exhaustion, the kind that settled deep when a man had carried more than his share of the world's cruelty. Nayeli clung to Rowan's sleeve, Issa tucked against his leg, and Tahoe hovered close, watching with wide, unblinking eyes as the chief raised his hand and declared, "This valley will not bleed for your ambitions." A sentence that rippled through the riders like a vow carved into stone. Malik spat weakly, "You can't strip a sheriff of law." But the chief answered simply, "A man strips himself of honor long before others take it." And that truth ended the argument better than any rifle ever could. The posse behind Malik hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances before one spoke up, voice tired and cracking. "We ain't following him no more, Rowan." And though the words weren't meant as praise, they felt like an invisible shift, the valley choosing who it trusted, who it didn't, who it would stand beside when dust rose again. The chief stepped closer to Rowan then, placing his palm over his own heart in a gesture of respect older than any badge, saying, "You carried our children when no one else would." And Rowan bowed his head slightly, answering, "I only did what a man ought to." But the murmurs from the warriors told him they saw more than humility. They saw the truth of a protector, a man who stood between danger and the small without needing a title to name him. Nayeli's soft whisper broke through the moment as she tugged Rowan's sleeve, saying, "You're safe now, aren't you?" And Rowan smiled faintly, brushing her hair from her face as he replied, "As long as you're safe, I am." And something warm and wordless passed through the gathered Apache, a shared understanding that protection was no longer one-sided. The chief lifted his chin and spoke loud enough for every soul in the valley to hear. "Tonight, we honor the man who returned what was stolen." And a wave of approval rose from the warriors, low but powerful, like thunder promising rain. Rowan swallowed hard, not used to such attention. But when Nayeli slipped her hand into his and Issa leaned against him with trust stronger than any oath, he felt something inside him shift. Something like belonging, unexpected and undeserved. Blooming slow and steady in a heart that had long forgotten it had room to grow. Night settled over the valley with a quiet that felt earned. The stars spreading like silver dust across the sky as the Apache camp gathered around a great central fire, its warm glow flickering across painted faces, braided hair, and the tired but hopeful eyes of 3 children who finally slept without fear. Rowan sat slightly apart at first, leaning against a worn cedar post near the edge of the firelight, feeling strangely out of place despite everything he'd done. Until the chief approached and lowered himself beside him with a slow, deliberate breath, saying, "You stood where many men would have run." And Rowan shrugged, eyes fixed on the flames as he replied, "Sometimes a man gets one choice in his life that decides the rest of it." The words rolling from him heavier than he expected, as if he had carried them for years without knowing. The chief nodded, gaze softening as he watched Nayeli, Issa, and Tahoe curled beneath blankets near the women, and he said, "They will speak your name long after this snow melts." A statement Rowan wasn't sure he deserved. But the warmth in the chief's voice made something inside him loosen. The women brought food then, corn cakes, roasted venison, hot broth, and one placed a bowl gently in Rowan's hands, meeting his eyes with a nod of gratitude so sincere he felt heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. As he ate, villagers approached one by one, some offering thanks, others laying small symbolic items at his feet. A carved feather for courage, a polished stone for honor, a strip of woven cloth for protection. And Rowan found himself overwhelmed by the quiet, steady reverence of a people who rarely gave such gestures lightly. When the children finally woke, they shuffled straight to him, climbing into his lap and leaning against him as if he had always been part of their nights, their world, their safety. And Rowan wrapped his arms around them carefully, afraid to breathe too deep in case the moment shattered. "Will you stay?" Nayeli whispered, voice small but anchored with hope. And Rowan looked at the chief, who gave a single, solemn nod, granting permission without conditions, without requirement, only respect. Rowan whispered, "If you want me to." And Nayeli pressed her forehead to his chest, a silent yes that carried more weight than any oath spoken aloud. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like tiny prayers, and Rowan let his eyes drift over the camp, the warriors talking quietly, the women weaving new blankets, the chief standing watch with arms folded, the children dozing against him. And he realized the valley no longer felt divided, no longer felt like two worlds waiting to collide. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something whole, something earned, something alive. And as dawn's first pale light touched the mountains, Rowan murmured to the sleeping children, "If stories like this travel far enough, maybe the world will remember what mercy can do." Letting the truth settle softly before adding, "If you're ready for another story, it's waiting just beyond the next horizon."